Good evening. My name is Zuruba Salibi, and I will be moderating the discussion today. I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone to this webinar. We are very pleased to have you here with us. So today's discussion is titled, "The ICC Must Step Up, Justice for Palestinians Awaits," which aims to discuss potential strategies to persuade the International Criminal Court to undertake concrete measures towards ensuring justice for the Palestinian people. This webinar comes in light of the message the Arab Organization for Human Rights has composed requesting the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, to progress the Palestinian case from the point left by his predecessor, Fatou Bensouda. This message highlights the escalating brutality of Israeli offenses against Palestinians who have been striving for justice and equity for decades against those infringing their fundamental rights. We are joined by a number of speakers who will discuss this issue from different perspectives. I'd like to thank them on behalf of the Arab Organization for Human Rights for being with us this evening. And we're really looking forward to hearing their comments and remarks. I'd also like to mention that there will be a discussion between our speakers following their comments at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, we will now hear from our first speaker, Mr. Mohammed Jamil, Chairman of the Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK. Mr. Jamil, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Roba. Good evening, everyone. Since the referral of the crimes committed in Palestine in June 13, 2014, the occupying forces haven't halted their criminal activities. Their actions are a blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and conspicuous defiance of the court's authority. From the start of this year, the occupation forces have claimed more than 145 lives, 28 of whom were children. In May, they showered the densely populated Gaza Strip with bombs and missiles, resulting in the death of 33 citizens, including 6 children and 4 women. In a matter of days, dozens of homes were demolished and inhabitants displaced. What does this all imply? How can we understand the continued settlement activities and the construction of thousands of residences by the occupation government? One of the latest projects announced just yesterday involves building a settlement in the E1 area, linking Ma'ale Adumim settlement with Jerusalem's settlements. This will disrupt any potential communication between the divided West Bank and Jerusalem. How can we make sense of the fact that the occupation forces continue their practices of arrest, torture, and administrative detention alongside their intentional medical negligence of prisoners, which has resulted in several deaths? The situation is further exacerbated by the stance of those representing the United Nations Secretary General and Western government. Without any shame or fear, they demand criminals to conduct an open investigation. They either forget or choose to ignore that such an approach has been employed in endless crimes for decades, yielding little to no substantial result in holding criminals accountable. All these actions signify the occupation government's disregard for international law and indifference to the international humanitarian community's opinion. Their stance is made possible by the boundless support from the West. Furthermore, the International Criminal Court's prosecuting office's apparent laxity in pursuing the criminals adds this picture. In conclusion, it's clear that the expectations we had for the International Criminal Court, particularly under the leadership of Mr. Karim Khan, to deliver justice in Palestine, have unfortunately dissipated. This level of disregard can only be seen as intentional and likely tied to political agenda that are agnostic to the court. If this situation isn't rectified by the General Assembly of the state parties within the court, it may seriously endanger the very existence of the court. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jamil. I think what you mentioned is really important about the intentional the disregard for Palestinians in the International Criminal Court. And maybe our other speakers can elaborate on this point, and maybe how this is a continuation, not an exception, of the disregard of the Palestinian rights in the International Criminal Court. We will now be moving to our next speaker, Kirsten Bays, who's a local outreach coordinator of Campaign Against Arms Trade. Kirsten, please, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Roba. As I say, my name is Kirsten Bays. I'm from Campaign Against Arms Trade, or CAT. And I wanted to thank the Arab Organization for Human Rights for inviting me to speak today. Hugely appreciated, for bringing everybody together. CAT is a UK-based organisation which works to end the international arms trade, and its priorities are to stop the export of arms where they might exacerbate conflict or oppression. Firstly, I'd like to express solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I think the case that we're trying to bring to the attention of the ICC is built on a long history of repression and conflict. It's hard to say, but you know, it is 75 years since the Nakba, and Israel continues to use military force to maintain an illegal blockade of Gaza and an occupation of the West Bank. As we've already heard, Palestinian people are subject to a campaign of continual harassment. So raids, arrests, detention, house demolitions, even murders by Israeli forces and of course settlers as well. And much of it goes unnoticed by the world's media. It seems the media only pay attention during sort of major incursions of the kind we've seen in Gaza most recently, and also in 2014. It's hard to understand why that is, but I think it's fair to say that it's part of a deliberate policy by the Israeli government to suppress journalism. And I'm sorry to say we've seen some of the direct action they've taken to do that. It's part of a structure or a system that feeds conflict around the world. The Israeli military are one of the world's most powerful. They're backed by advanced arms companies, by nation states like the US, Germany, the UK. And it's important to know the role those weapons play in the conflict, because if we're seeking to stop it through legal means, there's a wide range of opportunities that we do have, as well as going to the ICC. For example, something like 3/4 of Israel's arms imports comes from the United States, but the remaining 25%, most of that comes from the European Union. The European Union and the UK have, in theory, regulations that tell them not to be exporting weapons into conflict zones and where they could be used for the abuse of human rights. And as I watch the coverage that comes out of Palestine, it's hard. I find it almost impossible that anybody can be looking at that coverage, see the weapons exports going into Israel and not draw the conclusion that they're being used to commit war crimes. And yet the exports continue. The UK itself has licensed something like £474 million worth of exports since 2015. And that's only the kind of published system that they use for licensing weapons. They also have a very opaque system called the Open Licensing Scheme, which is actually not very open. And that's kind of used for kind of small components. And it could easily be as much, again, going through that system, going to Israel, to keep all these weapon systems working and to have them being used continually in Gaza and the West Bank. When we look at the breakdown of what actually goes to Israel from the UK, something like half of what was gone across is for so-called military technology, by which they mean components for aircraft, but also for drones and for other weapons, spy equipment, those sorts of things. But a lot of the remaining balance goes primarily for aircraft, helicopters, small arms, grenades, bombs, missiles. And again, as we look at the impact of those sales on the ground, it's very hard to justify that those sorts of exports to that kind of country for that kind of use without having giving a real pause for concern for the way that arms exports are monitored and regulated. One would argue that there might as well not be any controls because they clearly have no effect. More recently, the UK has been supplying advanced F-35 combat aircraft, and something like 15%, actually the UK, Israel's been buying the F-35, 15% of which are made by BAE Systems, which is the largest UK arms company. And currently, we can't track those licenses, but that's what BAE Systems themselves say they are exporting. And this is despite, again, quite strong and vigorous protests around BAE Systems' Wharton site and some of its sites around Blackburn over the last several years, strongly highlighting to local politicians and to the national government that what's going on at that site is clearly causing the death of Palestinians, and yet, unfortunately, nobody seems to be wanting to take action. And so it led to the kind of spectacle in 2021 of Britain and Israel forming a 10-year trade and defense pact. And I think we all saw pictures of, I think it was Netanyahu actually in Downing Street making that pact and doing the doing the deal that kind of cements that relationship. So we take as much action as we can. We pursue them in the courts and in the streets, but governments continue to do what they do. So it can be very easy to lose hope. Still, there is much good work being done. There's a lot of work around the sort of pushing for a two-way arms embargo. It's not very clear from what we've been saying, but Israel is also one of the world's largest arms exporters. And the UK has bought drones and has bought these Tammuz, so-called Exactor missiles that it's used in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it is high time that, as well as stopping our arms exports to Israel, we need to stop funding the IDF and Israel's arms industry by buying its products and using them in overseas wars. So the ICC prosecution that we're talking about, I think, is part of it. But I think what's also absolutely true is that we need to be stop funding Israeli arms development and the wars in Gaza and in the West Bank. So there's work being done. And over the last 5 years, you've seen a growing movement, which I think Sarah's going to be talking about fairly soon. But in 2018, we saw the UDT Arms Fair that was taking place in Glasgow, kicked out by popular pressure, primarily because people objected to the presence of Israeli arms companies who were who were supporting the blockade of Gaza fishermen. And again, it was fantastic to see hundreds, if not thousands of people in Glasgow who rolled out in support of Palestine. In 2020, we saw Liverpool have its largest ever well, certainly its largest peace demonstration in recent times. It was gigantic. It was a really large demonstration. Again, saying no to the arms fair there, and specifically talking about the spyware being sold by Israeli companies. And there's very unlikely to be another arms fair in the city. And they're now looking at how their local council is investing money supporting developments in the West Bank. I'd love to have made more notes as I was there, but I was holding the banner, so I couldn't actually make any notes as to what they were saying. But they're definitely busy. And as I say, I don't want to steal Sarah's thunder, but there's been a lot of work being done against Elbit, especially sort of seeing them driven out of Oldham and other places. So I think again, you know, it's a real sign that there is change afoot. So for me, the ICC prosecution, I think it's really important. But as I think we've already heard, a lot of it is kind of politically controlled and managed. So we as citizens and individuals need to be taking action in solidarity with the people of Palestine on the streets, and also writing to our MPs, writing to our banks, and getting them to change their ways, to deny Israel both legal support, but also moral and financial support, and to bring an end to the conflict and the oppression in the West Bank. Thank you. And Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was really important. I was going to ask you actually about if you think that pressure from the British public on the UK government can be an effective strategy in stopping arms trade with Israel, like the cases you mentioned in different places in the UK. Do you think that will lead or can lead to some changes in the policies that the UK government adopts, specifically in terms of arms trades, and yeah, like selling arms to Israel and funding its wars in Palestine?
I think I'd probably answer it with a negative, in the sense of one thing I can guarantee: if we take no action at all, the arms trading will continue. There's a lot of money being made, and there's a lot of power relationships going on. So I think it absolutely can make a difference. I think it is really hard, though, with this government, the government we currently have, to say that they will be affected by such actions. So I think that's why I can understand a lot of the work that's being done, if you like, to take physical action to physically stop arms exports, because that's kind of what's left. But I think we can change the climate, and over time, you know, we've seen other cases where countries have been, shall we say, excluded from our arms exports and from sort of normal relationships. And I think, again, where you consider that Israel is an apartheid state, and that it does some of the things that it does, you know, I definitely recall the campaign against South African apartheid, and you know, I think both South Africa itself and campaigners for Palestine have made that link, and I draw a lot of hope from that. And I have to say, having taken part in that campaign back when I was I was not so much smaller, but definitely younger, it seemed pretty hopeless at the time until it wasn't, and then change happened really quickly. So I think that's the thing we just need to keep our eye on, is that change is possible, and ordinary people can help bring it about.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess there is a lot of hope, and like we put our hope in the people, not the governments. And I think many Palestinians feel that way because we don't have any hope in governments anymore. Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was really powerful. We will now be moving to our next speaker, Dr. Nadia Najib, who's a senior lecturer in Palestine Studies in the University of Exeter. Dr. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruba. I am Nadia Nasser Najab, not Najib, Najab.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Yes,
it's
Najab.
Okay, it's no problem. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank, of course, the Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK for inviting me and for initiating the petition to ICC in such a timely manner. You know, I want to link to what Kirsten talked about, which is the arm and military support to Israel. But I want to discuss the international community action in action when it comes to Palestinians in terms of justice. I mean, we all know there has never been a response to all the crimes Israel commits from the ICC. This is because international rule and justice are not applied equally. We all know that, and Palestinians are constantly excluded. And Israel is never held accountable for these crimes, but also never held accountable for the arbitrary laws that allow such crimes. Like, for example, the case of Salah Harmouri. This is an Israeli law that revoked his citizenship and deported him from his homeland, due to, quote, lack of allegiance to the state of Israel, end of quote. That's the law, okay? Also, the Israeli Supreme Court, for example, ruled that Khan al-Ahmar should be razed completely. These are arbitrary laws, always against Palestinians, not a blink from the international community. There are two major issues related to law and justice that Palestinians face. One is that their narrative is excluded completely. Second, it's fought. It's not only excluding the narrative, but fighting it. Like in the case of Shireen, for example, Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian journalist who was killed by an Israeli sniper, according to multiple investigations, like by Al-Haq and CNN, independent investigation. However, Israeli internal investigation claimed that she was shot by mistake. How was the Palestinian narrative excluded? This report, the internal Israeli report, refused to engage with eyewitness testimonies who witnessed on what happened. It was, or I don't know if they saw the video footage as well. So denied any wrongdoing, of course, to avoid accountability, deflecting the blame and avoid accountability. But Shireen's case is not the only case. I don't know if you remember in 2000, September 2000, when Israel killed Muhammad al-Durra while he was hiding behind his father, his dad. The footage shocked the world, okay? At the beginning, Israel was like, maybe we killed him by mistake, maybe Israeli. In 2013, retracted this confession and stated that there is no evidence that an Israeli soldier shot Muhammad al-Durra. Okay, so denying, but what Israel did as well, or rather, I'd rather be accurate, pro-Israeli groups accused Talal Abu Rahmi, who shot the footage, of fabrication, that the video was fabricated, and they took him to court in France, who works with I believe he works with the France 24, maybe, I can't remember, don't quote me on that, but it's a French satellite TV or station, and they took him to court. Jenin invasion, for example, also in 2002, same period, did not allow UN to inquire and investigate, okay? Not only did not allow the investigation, fought Muhammad al-Bakri. This is very recent. It's in 2020 when the film Jenin, they took Muhammad al-Bakri to court. A soldier appeared in this Jenin documentary, and Israel banned the film, Jenin. So it's not only excluding, it's also fighting the Palestinian narrative. There are countless examples, but not only that, the international community hears Israeli settlers incite to violence against Palestinians and chant slogans like death to Arabs, for example, and turn a blind eye to that as well. not only turn a blind eye, sometimes they repeat the narrative of Israel, as we saw with Ursula, the EU Commission, the president of the EU Commission. Remember when she said on the anniversary of Israeli independence, to congratulate Israel on that day, she said, if you remember, you have made the desert bloom. So she's repeating Israeli narrative that it is a land without people, and Israel or Israelis made it bloom. This is dangerous. Not only that, Israel is also fighting Palestinian textbook, and the international community in EU in particular is complicit with Israel in that. Recently, this year, the Commissioner for Neighborhood and Enlargement announced that they will make sure that the EU is not funding, and I'm quoting now, will make sure it's not funding Palestinian textbooks that incite against Israel. So this is the role of the international community, not only turning a blind eye, but being proactive, emphasizing and reiterating Palestinian narrative. Okay. Now, on the issue of hope, of course there is hope, and I love this sentence by James Baldwin, the American who fought for equality and justice all his life. He said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And this is to link to Kirsten comments on hope. And I am sure you all remember, you all read about the law student, the graduate student, Fatima Muhammad speech at the City University of New York, when she criticized the legal system and she said, Palestine can no longer be the exception to our pursuit of justice. And she said that we want the law to achieve justice and not deflect the will of the powerful. Well, where is the hope that this new generation is not afraid to speak up and to fight for equality and justice for Palestinians and other also oppressed groups? The hope also resides in the response of the Student University Jewish Law Student Association. They issued a statement because Fatima was attacked, named and shamed because of what she said, because she referred to Palestine. And the Jewish Law Student Association, here's their quote from their statement: as a public interest, and I'm quoting now, as a public interest focused law school, we have a duty to stand with Palestinians against Zionist oppression, as Fatima has done. In her commencement speech, Fatima describes the unique nature of the City University of New York law and the values it embodies that brought many students to our school, end of quote. See, so, I mean, there is hope with the new, and you, Ruba, also mentioned that there is, of course, hope in people to stand up for oppression. There's a recent report, I'm sure you've heard about it. It was last week by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Territories. Also talked about, this includes East Jerusalem, Israel, everywhere. Also talked about Israeli crimes. Not only that, the report recommended that the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court prioritize the investigation into the situation in the occupied. And of course, you are all aware of the other reports that talked about Israel as an apartheid state from the river to the sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadia. You raised many important points, specifically, of course, on the issue of hope. And I agree with you that with the younger generation, I think there's a lot of hope. And also on the complicity of the international community in silencing the Palestinian narrative and voices. I think this is something that maybe we'll discuss at the end of the webinar after we hear our speakers. So just to give all of our speakers the time for their comments and remarks, we will be now moving to Dr. Ramzi Baroud, a Palestinian American journalist and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. Dr. Ramzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this, and your speakers, and to the Arab Human Rights Organization for bringing us together to discuss this issue. I would like to just do a very quick, if you don't mind, a very quick summary of what is going on at the ICC that would help us understand where is the pressure points, what can we do more or less precisely in order for us to force, if you will, the ICC into moving forward with the war crimes investigation that has been already approved years ago by the Office of the Prosecutor. And that jurisdiction, as we all know, covers the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, even though the time of that jurisdiction supposed to cover, back to 2014. So it will cover the 2014 war and everything that happened since then. The Palestinians, of course, want to enlarge in the scope of that investigation to go beyond or prior to 2014. And they also want to enlarge in the scope of the investigation regarding the topics itself, because we all know that the ICC covers more than just war crimes. They cover war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, or crimes against peace, along with a very specific criteria of crimes, and including, of course, the crime of genocide. And all of these crimes can be argued since 1948 until today have actually been committed by Israel. So why aren't we moving forward? There's total clarity, and the jurisdiction of the court has already been verified by the pre-trial chamber. So why are we still kind of stuck waiting for Mr. Karim Khan to move forward with that investigation that should have been not only carried through, but in fact concluded? And this is not an exaggeration. I mean, the fact that the ICC has managed to carry out an investigation based on referrals by other countries that are not even involved in the ICC. Russia and Ukraine are not members of the ICC. They are not signatories, and they are not, and therefore they haven't ratified the Rome Statute. And some of the countries that have pushed the ICC to indict alleged war criminals in Russia include the United States, actually mainly the United States, which is not only not a member of the ICC, not a friend of the court, has not ratified the ICC, the Rome Statute, but has actually, during the Trump administration, passed an executive order that would punish ICC judges, including Fatou Bensouda herself, for carrying out or pursuing alleged war crimes against Israel in occupied Palestine and against the United States military in Afghanistan. Yet they managed, within the course of a single year, to issue arrest warrants of Putin, Lavnovna, and others within the accused Russian war crime cartel. Within the case of Palestine, this has been going on for years. Palestine was admitted to the ICC in early January 2015. The ICC began preliminary investigations 2 weeks after that took place. In 2019, we're talking 4 years here, the Office of the Prosecutor concluded that the issue of territorial jurisdiction, meaning the ICC's jurisdiction over the investigation in Palestine, Israel, needed to be resolved before the investigation carried forward. That doesn't make much sense. And you don't need to be a legal expert to actually understand that it doesn't make sense. I say it doesn't make sense because Palestine has already been admitted as a state into the ICC and has ratified the Rome Statute. Therefore, Palestine alone, without the help of any Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern country or any country in the global south, doesn't need to be referred. It refers itself. It happened in about 7 other cases, all in Africa, in which cases were referred directly to the ICC. But when it came to Palestine, they said, let's get a different opinion. And why is that? Why changing the legal dynamics and send the issue back to the pretrial chamber? But believe it or not, the pretrial chamber said that yes, the issue of jurisdiction should be resolved. The ICC has jurisdiction over the situation in Palestine, Israel. During that time, as if the ICC, so what I'm saying here, the issue precedes that of Karim Khan. Let's not be confused that Karim Khan has started this mess. He's part of the mess. But then Bensouda went and said, well, let's get a different opinion. Let's open up the stage for what they call amici curiae, the friends of the court, to come and offer their legal opinions. Basically, they wanted lobby groups to lobby within the ICC legal and political structure on behalf of Israel. So you had countries that the Czech Republic, Germany, Austria, and others, and Hungary, of course, they came and they started lobbying on behalf of Israel, saying the ICC does not have jurisdiction. Palestine needs to become a state, full state first, before that to be, before the investigation to carry on, and so forth and so on. At last, 2021, Bensouda said, the ICC has jurisdiction and an investigation is now open. But it stopped there. And I think that is the challenge that we Palestinians have, is that now we have a conclusion from the ICC itself that it has jurisdiction, that Palestine is a state according to the ICC's own standards of statehood, and therefore an investigation is not should be open, but is officially open. But that doesn't mean much if we don't have an actual procedure. And this is where really the big challenge is for Palestinians, because now we are discovering that the ICC, not that we did not know, but now we are discovering that the ICC is actually not illegal structure, but rather illegal and apolitical. In fact, I would say mainly political structure and then illegal structure. So we need to find how do we fight within the ICC. Now, the friends of the court, the amici curiae of the ICC don't just include the pro-Israel countries. It includes the Arab leagues and the Organization of Islamic Countries, among others. And we have to work with these friends of the courts who are lobbying on behalf of Palestine to put greater pressure on Karim Khan, because we are closer than ever in actually getting that investigation moving forward. And there is the issue of credibility that the ICC now has because of their hypocrisy, comparing the way that they are investigating alleged war crimes in Russia compared to their failure to move forward on the alleged war crimes carried out in Palestine. And even if the scope of the investigation is not enlarged to include prior dates and years, like some of the crimes committed before 2014, as discussed by Nadia and others, even if that doesn't happen, and even if the definition of war crimes remain confined to a single type of war crimes, still there are very strong cases to be made that Israeli war criminals, many of them, should be paraded before the international community, and they should be held legally and morally accountable for crimes committed in Palestine since then and that are being committed in Palestine every single day. The latest being a young teenager killed in Balata, and yesterday and the day before and the day before that. All of this has to be investigated, but for that to happen, we need to understand that the ICC is not an independent legal procedure, and we just need to wait and see where the law is going to take us. We need to understand that it's a political institution, and therefore nothing but political pressure would work in these kind of situations. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramzi. That was very, very insightful. And maybe later we can also maybe talk more about the issue of the double standards on the issue of Ukraine, Russia, and Palestine. And of course, we know that, yeah, like for years, Palestinians haven't been able to get any kind of justice from the International Criminal Court, precisely because of like its political structure and how it's controlled by countries like the US mainly. We would love to hear more about this in the discussion bit after. We will now be moving to our next speaker, Sarah Wilkinson, a pro-Palestinian activist from the UK. Sarah, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for inviting me on. And yeah, I am with some very eminent speakers. It's very nice to see Kirsten again. Haven't seen you for a long while. I haven't really got a speech prepared. I think I come from the Palestine Action angle, where I suppose hope was the thing that was mentioned, but also while we Palestine Action have been incredibly successful in closing at least 2 Israeli arms factories down, what we as activists started to notice that the British state, the British police, the court system, everything is all entangled in the same pot. So even if you're not doing anything arrestable, you'll be arrested just for being there. And it seems that the arm of the law, the police, the courts, absolutely everything, just to get you removed off site so that you can no longer be an influential character or a key figure. So I think, yes, there's great positives because huge numbers of young people are coming on board. They're seeing what Elbit is, what Israeli arms factories are doing. They're starting to join the dots together and realize that we don't want to be complicit with the making of Israeli weapons and the drones and the other munitions that the Israeli arms manufacturers are responsible for. And especially when something concrete happens in Palestine where the dots are very, very closely connected, like when we were protesting outside Leicester's UTAX, which is another subsidiary of Elbit, one Palestinian person was actually killed by a payload drop from a drone. So the connections brought people, encouraged young people to join us. And so for that reason, there is a lot of hope. We then find out that Elbit now is opening 2 more subsidiaries or 2 more factories in Morocco, one in Casablanca. So it's preparing the way for, okay, we may not be able to survive the UK because there's this huge movement to get us shut down. So what we'll do is we'll start opening other factories in other countries, and we've seen in Germany, but also Austria, I think, and now Morocco. So the fight to get Israeli arms companies out of Britain doesn't necessarily mean that the Israeli regime is going to stop manufacturing Israeli weapons to use against the Palestinian people. So we're sort of caught in that trap of, it's not just that we want to stop being complicit, we actually want Palestine Action to become international so that every country is then putting the same amount of pressure and using direct action to shut these lethal companies down. But I think there was one point somebody made, and it reminded me, you know, of I think it was Professor Richard Falk said, if you don't enforce international law, it doesn't exist. And for me, that is a very important phrase, because I think what's happening with the ICC, what's happening with international law, the numerous United Nations resolutions, they don't go anywhere. They go nowhere. And, you know, the powers that be, and you've seen what happened with Roger Waters, with his tour, because he's pro-Palestinian, he's anti-war, he's anti-imperialist. you know, and he has a huge amount of integrity. The attempt to shut him down in case he should influence thousands of people across the UK and in other countries has been huge. I think it's backfired, but it's been huge. And so, yeah, I have a lot of hope with Palestine Action. I know that the engine room of Palestine Action will not cease. It will not stop until every Israeli arms factory is shut down in this country. And I kind of know that from the energy that comes from, if you like, what I call the engine room, and the numbers of people that are being recruited, the numbers of people that want to join, that want to take part in direct action. The age of people is getting a little bit younger. There's more students getting involved. In fact, the pro-Palestinian movement at the moment is becoming huge. And I think that's why you're seeing so much resistance from the establishment, because it's growing. And it's growing so enormously, it's noticeable. So I think, yeah, I have hope for Palestine Action. I have hope for some of the movements on the ground. But what I see is this enormous amount of pressure coming from our leaders and governments to silence the Palestinian narrative, to silence the movement, to stop people or to make people fearful of being outspoken about Palestinian justice and rights and the inalienable right to return home. So I think there's enormous pressure coming from the top, but there's also enormous recruitment and pressure coming from the bottom. So maybe we meet together and the people power wins. Let's just hope.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And you're right. I think Palestine Action presents us with a very hopeful example of how like people's resistance to their governments, specifically now in the case of Palestine, is actually is a very powerful tool that people can use in forms of direct action. And I think, as you said, like if Palestine Action becomes an international movement, this is like, it would be great. Thank you so much again, Sarah.
Yeah.
That was great. We will now be moving to our final speaker, actually, Dr. Ralph Wild, who's an associate professor at the Faculty of Law in UCL. But Dr. Ralph couldn't join us like in person today, but he sent us recording, which we will now be showing. We'll actually show parts of it, but I will post the link to the full recording in the chat box if anyone is interested in hearing the full recording.
Hello, I'm Ralph Wild. On the 30th of December 2022, the United Nations General Assembly voted to request that the International Court of Justice in The Hague render an advisory opinion, essentially on whether or not the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, is illegal, and if so, what the consequences of this are for Palestine and the Palestinian people, for Israel, for other states and international organizations, including the United Nations. This legal opinion is from the United Nations Court, which hears disputes between states and also provides such opinions to the UN. It's entirely separate from the nearby International Criminal Court, which applies international criminal law to individuals. However, the ICJ will be applying all areas of international law to answer the question put to it. Although it cannot determine individual criminal responsibility, it will have to determine violations of international law that such individual criminal responsibility would be based on, since individual criminal responsibility is essentially a subset of the areas of international law that states are responsible for. The ICJ will also address those other violations of international law that don't give rise to individual criminal responsibility. So what then will the ICJ have to address? I'll summarize what I've set out in a legal opinion you can find online, which I published the day of the General Assembly vote requesting the opinion of the ICJ. I should make it clear that what I am saying here is based on that only. Since publishing my legal opinion, I was asked to serve as senior counsel and advocate to the League of Arab States in this case. I must stress that my remarks today are based exclusively on that earlier legal opinion published before I was taken on by the League of Arab States, and nothing in what I am saying here now should be taken as any indication of the view of the League of Arab States, either generally or in the context of the advisory proceedings, the advisory opinion proceedings before the ICJ in particular. Now, legality or illegality can refer to the existence of the occupation or its conduct or both. As to existential legality or illegality, the occupation, simply by virtue of exercising control over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, consequently preventing the Palestinian people from full and effective self-governance, constitutes a fundamental impediment to the realization of the right of self-determination enjoyed by the Palestinian people in international law. The only basis such an impediment could legally be justified is according to the law on the use of force, the jus ad bellum. Assuming hypothetically that Israel had a right of self-defense in 1967 that justified legally the introduction of the occupation then, and that is an assumption, this justification has not persisted, if it did persist and exist at the time, nor has an alternative legal justification arisen. There has been no actual or imminent armed attack justifying as necessary and proportionate the occupation as a means of self-defense. And the doctrine of anticipatory or preventative self-defense, justifying the occupation as a means of stopping a threat from emerging, has no basis in international law. Neither United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 nor the so-called Oslo Accords provide an alternative legal basis for the existence or the continuation of the occupation. Indeed, the Oslo Accords are themselves violative of international law because consent to them by the PLO was coerced through the illegal use of force, and relatedly, they conflict with norms of international law that have a special non-derogable or jus cogens status, which are the norms prohibiting the use of force other than in self-defense and the right of self-determination. More generally, there is no international law right to maintain the occupation pending a peace agreement, and or as a means of creating facts on the ground that might give Israel advantages in relation to such an agreement, and or as a means of coercing the Palestinian people into agreeing a settlement to the situation that they wouldn't accept otherwise. The consequence of what I've said is that there is no valid international law basis for the existence of the occupation. In consequence, the occupation is an unlawful use of force, an aggression, and a violation of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people on the part of Israel, and, in the case of aggression, also potentially a crime on an individual level for senior Israeli leaders. As a result, the occupation is existentially illegal and must end immediately. Legally, the requirement of termination is not contingent on particular circumstances being present. Specifically, the following factors or conditions cannot be by themselves a pretext for delaying termination. willingness, or consent by Israel, the adoption of a peace agreement, the adoption of standards within or the giving of undertakings by the Palestinian people, approval by the United Nations, the Quartet, or other states. So in consequence, every day that the occupation continues is a breach of international law. The existential illegality of the occupation arises out of the simple fact of the occupation as a system of control and domination without a valid legal basis. This is then compounded by the occupation's prolonged duration, its link to de jure and de facto annexation, and the egregious abuses perpetrated against the Palestinian people. The use of military force to annex territory is also an independent basis for existential illegality, also a violation of the international law of the use of force, and also an aggression at both the state level and potentially in terms of individual criminal responsibility. By contrast, the prolonged length of the occupation and its abusive nature are not independent bases for existential illegality, but are relevant as aggravating factors to the question of existential legality as a matter of the law on the use of force. The abusive nature is also relevant to the separate matter of legality or illegality of conduct. Any purported annexations are also without legal effect, because in international law, Israel is not and cannot be sovereign over any part of the West Bank or Gaza, including East Jerusalem, through the assertion of a claim to this based on the exercise of effective control enabled through the use of force, and in the absence of consent to such annexation freely given by the Palestinian people. As to the legality or illegality of the conduct of the occupation, there are multiple egregious breaches of the relevant areas of applicable international law. And those are the laws of war, or the law of armed conflict, or the jus in bello, or international humanitarian law, including occupation law, international human rights law, and within this, the prohibition of racial discrimination generally and apartheid in particular. These are breaches at the level of the state of Israel and also, in some cases, depending on further findings on individual criminal responsibility, individual crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of apartheid, and the crime of torture. So to conclude then, the occupation is illegal in both its existence and its conduct. And in both cases, this gives rise to both state and potentially individual criminal responsibility. Thank you.
Yes, that was Dr. Ralph speaking to us through recording. We have 5 to 7 minutes left, and I'd like to dedicate this time for a small discussion, but also if any of our speakers have any comment or an addition or something that they would like to the discussion, that would be great. But I also have one question directed to all of our speakers, and feel free like if any of our speakers would like to answer that, which is the question is related actually to the ICC and if Palestinians should continue in pursuing justice through this organization that we've known for decades that haven't taken any action in bringing Israeli leaders accountable for the many and countless crimes they committed against Palestinians. Is the ICC as a legal and political structure, as Dr. Ramsey mentioned, is something that Palestinians should rely on, or We've also heard from our other speakers about the other forms of mobilizations and direct action that have been taken place by people and not by institutions. And should we have more hope in that? I know that like they are not mutually exclusive, but I would also like to hear your thoughts about the International Criminal Court as a legal structure that Palestinians can get any form of justice through. Is it a battle that is worth the fight? I don't know if Dr. Ramzi or Dr. Nad.
I don't want to hijack too much time beyond the time allocated to this, so I'm just going to make it very brief. I think it all depends on how we are. Are we approaching the ICC and UNESCO and all other international institutions and the ongoing fight within these institutions? For example, the United States, as of today, decided that as of July 1st, they are going to be back in UNESCO. And they are going to be back basically to monitor China and to ensure that American vision for peace is going to be protected in the Middle East. Don't get me started in this nonsense. But the fact is, the US is using these institutions as a way to lobby for Israel and to protect Israel and the Israeli turf against anyone who dares push against it. Now, I have a particular opinion about the ICC and UNESCO and others that is different from my view, say, of the United Nations Security Council, because that is largely prejudiced by American veto and American control and pressure. The ICC and UNESCO and the ICJ and others are governed by different mechanisms that are largely more democratic. But even within democratic structures, you still have countries, shameless, brazen countries like the United States that would use all means to ensure that they get their agenda sorted out at the end of the day. Does it mean we abandon it? Absolutely not. We fight in every possible sphere and space in order for us to get what, to advance our cause, even if through starting a global conversation on Palestine. I always argue that even in the battles we lose, we win, because at least we are talking about Palestine in every possible platform. But the problem is when we put all of our eggs in a single basket and expect that justice is going to come from the ICC. I don't know if you guys heard the supposed president of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, speak at the United Nations a few weeks ago, in which he was asking for international protection. It was really quite embarrassing, considering that is actually the Palestinian resistance that are providing the best kind of protection for people in Gaza. It's going to be eventually Palestinian resistance that will stop Israel in its tracks, and it's going to be the Palestinian resistance that will liberate Palestine with the support and solidarity of the international community and civil societies everywhere else. But the ICC is still important. UNESCO and every other platform. BRICS is important. We need to utilize all available platforms. But that doesn't mean that the fight starts at the ICC, because if that's going to be the case, then we are going to definitely lose this fight. So it's all about prioritizing and nothing else.
I have also something to add on this, following Ramzi's comments. Actually, it's sad because the root cause of such situation with our relationship with the international community and the UN and the UN resolutions is related to Oslo Agreement. I mean, during those negotiations, the Israelis insisted and convinced, unfortunately, Palestinian negotiators to exclude international community. Let's solve our problems together. Don't mention UN. Don't mention these resolutions. We will sort it out together. That's one thing. Second, the problem is with our division. I mean, on the government level, or on the official level, let's say, or the Palestinian Authority level, it is divided. There's no democracy. Unfortunately, there's a cooperation on security coordination. between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. So we are talking about, there's a schism, there's a separation between the Palestinian Authority and the demands of people. I mean, all of these initiatives of resistance, such as the one that was in 2021, was the initiative of the civil society, of the activists, of Palestinian resistance. It wasn't the initiative of the Palestinian Authority. On the contrary, they put obstacles to Palestinians who are resisting. So, yeah, I mean, there is a problem within the Palestinian politics that is divided. But at the same time, I am sure that people uniting together, along with, as Ramzi said, with other solidarity groups, should be able to rectify such division. Might take time. We need to be patient, step by step. And I agree with you, Ramzi. No matter, I mean, even if it's a small step. And I'll give you an example because I lived the first Intifada and I was an activist in the first Intifada. I remember very well before the first Intifada, people reached a state of helplessness to a certain extent, that the situation will not change. That's it. Israel was convinced that everything is in place, and Palestinians seem to be accommodating to the occupation, to what Moshe Dayan called the enlightened occupation. And then all of a sudden, people were like, no, we will not accept humiliation. We want independence. We want our human rights. And there you go. There was the first Intifada. So you never know. You never know. I always have hope that people's power, we should always make sure that one day it will start something that will not stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadia and Dr. Ramzi, for your answers. We ran out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for this very insightful discussion. I think I learned a lot, and I'm sure there are many more things to say, but maybe we'll leave it for a later webinar. But I'd like to thank everyone again for their time and for their insightful comments. And I wish you all a beautiful evening, and ending on a hopeful note that, like, People's United, I think there's a lot of hope and people's power and resistance. And I think it's always important to remember that. Thank you all again, and I wish you a beautiful night.